Alrighty, good afternoon. So the way I set my project up was more or less to structure it as a undergraduate lecture, as one of the options were. I felt that way I could attempt to tell more of a coherent story while also going into enough detail to sort of inform the topic wider. Um, Sort of like with any Cold War history, there is a tendency of historians to kind of draw the line back a little too far, and I did my best in this case to not do that. Share my screen. Can jump right into it. Okay, so Cold War economics, UN and the United States in Korea. I hope that the captions aren't showing up here. Either way, it doesn't matter. Okay, so Cold War economics. I want to start by discussing the state of Korea today. It's the fourth largest economy in Asia, 12th in the world. It falls behind China, Japan, and Taiwan. It's a capitalist nation, obviously. Structurally, a wide majority of it is urban, 81.5%, as you can see here by this graph, and 18.5% rural. That trend is continuing in that direction. There is a slight issue with the agricultural sector of Korea, although, as we'll get into later in the discussion, that's not a critical issue because so much of their economy is export-import based. It's a big game of ANO, if you will. Nonetheless, they are very much recently, at least, shifting towards a market-oriented economy rather than a state-controlled one. In the early years of the nation of Korea, the state was by all means in control of every section of the population and the economy. In fact, under Syngman Rhee, the original president, and then further onto Park, the democracy that existed in Korea was more or less removed and turned into a one-party system. As time has gone on, Korea has slowly liberalized, meaning that democracy has been slowly introduced, but nonetheless, there is a rather singular form of statehood that has existed in Korea for some time. It industrialized rapidly in the 1960s. Korea has only been a country since 1945, and then even still, it didn't really gain its autonomy until after the Korean War. It has sparse natural resources. It does have a small mining sector, nothing significant enough that it would support any type of economic output generally. It's pretty it's somewhat mixed. There is a textile industry, although it's not very flamboyantly produced. There is some small scale textile work. It's more focused on heavy industry and tech. In that way, it's a highly specialized economy. There is a select number of export companies that are heavily subsidized by the state, and they offer tax breaks and further subsidy for companies that continue to push an export model of production in Korea. A few examples there. We have LG, Hyundai, Samsung. These are a few companies in Korea that receive significant financial support from the state because they are sort of fulfilling that economic dream that they have, more or less. So, as I mentioned, Korea has only been a country since 1945, but if you want to call it statehood in its true form, then you can consider it a country after 53. Nonetheless, 70 years later, here we are, and it's number 12 in the world. That's pretty unprecedented growth. If you consider the United States, its economic power that it developed wasn't until the last 100 years. So nonetheless, it is a significant factor to try to understand how something like this can happen. Why did Korea go from a highly agricultural economy in the earlier period around early Japanese imperialism and before, and how did it blossom into this highly technological, highly specialized economy that we see today. To tell this story, you do need to go back quite a bit. First, I want to open up with a discussion of Japanese imperialism, because without that, it is difficult to try to understand where Korea finds itself today. Japanese imperialism really kicked off around the Meiji Restoration, Meiji and Meiji. I hear it both ways, and that was sort of in response to the burgeoning powers of Europe starting to find their way more directly into the Southeast Asian hemisphere, so to speak. Part of this, of course, is Commodore Matthew Perry's open door policy and this gunboat diplomacy that Japan eventually employed later. It's pretty remarkable when you look at Japanese history in this way that you can see that they really did sort of adopt a very Western style of not only imperialism, but the way they would function in their state. Not so much American, but very European. So in that way, you could consider their change in this era around 1868 as being both a westernization and a modernization project. I do think it's valid to separate the two. Some historians do sort of conflate the two, but nonetheless, westernization as sort of a forward policy, or in a sense a modernizing policy, does not fully encapsulate the diversity by which a lot of countries develop in their own ways. So separating the two, nonetheless, Japanese development in the 19th century was very Western, and that was on purpose. Japanese imperialism, much like early European imperialism, was based around resource extraction. Of course, Japan is a small archipelago off the coast of, excuse me, I'll get my timer, is a small archipelago off the coast of China. And so with that, they needed to gather resources to continue to build this empire. They didn't have room to expand on their own territory, so they needed to start reaching out to these different ones. And so there are a lot of historical examples of their imperialist and colonization of China. I'm not going to get into that specifically here, but nonetheless, it is important to recognize. So after the Meiji Restoration, they, similar to Korea, had a very quick turnaround in how they began to develop, being forced to sign open door policies and treaties that they opened the door to the West. They started to reconsider their position and look to situate themselves among European powers. So with that, we have the first Sino-Japanese War of 1894. Significant victory considering the size of the state and how fast it had developed its military. Even more significant, however, is the Russo-Japanese War, which by all measures Russia should have won, but the Japanese Navy was able to defeat them. And with that, they sort of did earn that spot at the European table, so to speak. Prior to that, they were still looked on as an Oriental nation that sort of didn't really find its position in that region. And with that war, they were finally able to address Western powers as equals and receive that sort of acknowledgement. And because of that, they received sort of a blank check to do what they wanted in the territory. So 18 small treaties later, we find ourselves at the annexation of Korea in 1910. This was their first major sort of diplomatic jump into Korea, jumping to a later point there. Korea, prior to that, was sort of diplomatically split between China and Japan. They, similar to a lot of Asian nations, practiced a closed door policy to the West. They, similar to China, weren't very interested in trading with Western powers, but did experience similar intrusions. I'm thinking specifically of the United States gunboats and, if I'm remembering correctly, Portuguese boats that sort of interrogated their waters, and they would take surveys of their lands not unprovoked, but unapprovingly. If I'm phrasing that incorrectly, I apologize. Nonetheless, prior to the annexation, there was the Japan-Korea Protectorate Treaty of 1905. This was very much a response to Japan's recent military success. As I mentioned, because of their success in the Russo-Japanese War, they were able to garner enough geopolitical authority to be able to annex these different territories around them with no resistance, especially from Russia, as Korea did have sort of, or excuse me, different nations had their tendrils in Korea and were interested in subsuming them themselves. But since Japan had become a military powerhouse in the region, they got the cake. As I said, Japan did practice this sort of gunboat diplomacy. There was never a official Korea-Japanese war. They very much showed up with a bunch of big guns and told them that they needed to sign this treaty. And there was a lot of contention actually in the last 10, 15 years where Korea and Japan had summit meetings where they finally put to rest a lot of these unequal treaties as they acknowledged them, that they more or less relinquished any sort of unfair diplomatic control of the region, but de facto that was gone since 1945. Moving on. So Japan and Korea, or as it was renamed, Joseon. Gonna take a shot with that one. Nonetheless, Joseon existed between 1910 and 1945 with the establishment of just the annexation treaty. Excuse me. A lot of this began slowly. There was a sort of air of this protectorate territory that Japan had installed at the time, but as it developed, Japan became far more aggressive in flat out replacing all political and military officers in the region, creating a military government. You can consider it the state of Korea, or Joseon, was effectively a military territory, colony, however you want to phrase it. And so with that, this sort of top-down replacement of Korean authority in the regions dissipated. And further, Japan offered incentives, let's say, to Japanese citizens to move to the territory, very much in a sort of Baltic idea of like kind of cross-pollination of populations and sort of ingratiating themselves into a territory that way. Not quite a forcible population swap, but nonetheless significant enough that it affected Korean culture more broadly. So Japan brought to Korea rapid industrialization. As I mentioned earlier, Korea at this time was an agricultural state, not so much a fledgling industry. They brought roads, ports, railroads, basic infrastructure that would allow Japan to extract the resources that they wanted from Korea as effectively as they wanted. Along with that, they organized agriculture, forestry, and just basic textile and soft industry just across the state. Once again, I will try not to repeat this too much, but it was very much a sort of old school European style colonial extraction project. They did, in fact, move Koreans off subsistence. In this way, it was a sort of unique colonial project, as we've discussed in class. There was sort of a transition around this time where colonial powers, especially in Europe, sort of refashioned their ideas around imperialism. And Japan didn't quite go one way or the other. They sort of did have this cultural aspect, which we'll discuss in the next slide, but they still had their sights set on resource extraction. So that's an important thing to keep in mind here, especially as we transition away from the Japanese period of Korea. The conditions were terrible, just blatantly. Farmers were displaced off their land if they didn't produce enough for the Japanese, which always wasn't enough. And so Japanese farmers were able to take the land. And further, land was stolen legally from Korean business owners. So just anyone of Japanese descent that wanted Korean territory got it legally. And this, of course, became a huge problem after the Japanese expulsion from the peninsula. Heavy peasant tax. This was another way to sort of expropriate a lot of resources from the Korean population and benefit the Japanese. And further, there were instances of forced, just call it what it is, slave labor in the region where Japanese imperialists would use Korean labor to produce a lot of the infrastructure. So mentioning earlier the kind of newer development of like justified industrialization, as you can put it, there was a sort of recognized movement of Japanization, wherein they would transplant their culture, just cultural identity broadly, onto a new territory. So this was very much the case in Korea. As I mentioned here, it is a very Western justification, but I think specifically to the earlier readings that we've had about English influence in India, where India would sort of not really knowingly or willingly adopt English cultural norms just for the sake of ingratiating themselves into the communities. Very similar here, although it was much more heavy-handed by the Japanese. So yeah, dropping Japanese culture into Korea, the first thing they did was change the language. Korea was banned from being taught, and so it was a sort of generational expectation that it would eventually fade out. And we can see in a lot of different instances of industrialization projects, or excuse me, imperialization projects, something similar in this way, that by removing sort of a history, a culture, and a language, the people would be far less resistant. And there was certainly resistance, I think specifically of the March 1st resistance movement, where Koreans did actively fight against the Japanese, but that effort was quashed. So as I mentioned, language, the name change, or legalized name, excuse me, forcible legal name change of Koreans. They moved away from the not dynastic, I'm not finding the word momentarily, clan. So clan names, they removed that and moved them to a surname structure so that the government could accurately document the Korean people. Their history was not taught in public school, although Japan did force agricultural communities to attend primary schooling. They were forced to convert to Shinto religion, the religion of Japan. And there was a military draft wherein the Koreans would have to participate on behalf of Japan during World War II. In fact, there are stories of some Korean soldiers being affected by nuclear bomb blasts. Indirectly, there was also a soft incentive for Koreans to ingratiate themselves into the Japanese community. As I mentioned with English imperialism in India, there was a similar phenomenon where Koreans would try to adopt as much Japanese culture as they could to sort of soften their oppression on behalf of their family. And there's obviously many, many factors along with the economic benefit. They could never shirk their Korean identity entirely, but there were many who chose to sort of enter into Japanese culture willingly. I'm thinking, again, of not necessarily cross-pollination, but Korean communities in Japan after the fall of the Japanese Empire. They had the option to return to Korea, but elected not to. I think it was around 700,000 people. So moving on from this section of Korean history, war. So we'll see this guy a few times. It's Edwin Starr, the guy that sang the "What Is It Good For" song. Anyway, so World War II comes, obviously starting in 1939, 41 for the Pacific Theater, ending in 45. After the Allied victory in the Pacific and the assistance of Russia, especially at the last second of the war, they gained a seat at the table to sort of dictate the, I suppose you could call it, fallout of the Pacific Theater. So what resulted in this was partitioning of many different territories around the region, Korea especially. This was sort of first mentioned at the Yalta Conference, where the United States and the Soviet Union decided that In the north, the Soviet Union would establish the Soviet Civil Administration, led by Kim Il-sung. In the United States would form the United States Army Military Government in Korea. Very wordy. Led by MacArthur initially, and then eventually subsumed by Syngman Rhee after the United States encouraged localized elections wherein the Koreans could pick their next leader. We'll get into that. It's much more nuanced than that, but nonetheless, the United States and the Soviet Union separated the peninsula in two, which would eventually become the 38th parallel divide that would be the contending battleground for the Korean War. You can kind of think of this too as like a geographical determinist way of thinking of it, that the North was situated along the Chinese border, which at this point had become communist, so there was incentive for that to be the territory closer to the Soviet Union. Blah, blah, blah. Not entirely relevant, but it's something to consider. After the fall of the Japanese Empire, the heavy and soft industries that had been developed by the Japanese remained. So what to do with that? What eventually was decided was that the Koreans would take back in all this territory and take control and nationalize all these industries. However, the Japanese economic funding of these different industries was at this point absent. So that hole needed to be filled. And at this point, Japan's internal economics had been crippled by the Japanese. Once again, very similar to a lot of different types of European imperialism, as excuse me, sorry, similar to European imperialism in that they would extract as much value from these different territories, and then when it was time for them to leave, be it through force or voluntarily, which obviously is rare, they would leave the societies that they attacked and conquered more or less wounded. MacArthur led this democratization of Korean industry and this repatriation of resources. But as I said, the economic foundation to support these industries wasn't there. So the United States, in the interest of maintaining the Truman era doctrine of containment, saw it as necessary to fill that void and begin to subsidize Korean industry. As I said, it was a containment project. They saw it as absolutely critical that they maintain in their words, westernized state. There's a CIA report discussing the condition of Korea, both the North and the South, in 1948, so 2 years before the war. And they discussed the military status, the economic status, and the political status of each of these. And most important in this project, of course, the economic status of South Korea at the time was very, very fragile. And that was due to a few factors. Politically, the sort of contention of this far-right president who the United States saw as the potentially most fortuitous for them, which of course is Syngman Rhee. They saw his ascension as being the most likely to be profitable and support a Western dogmatic approach to government. They saw the aggression of Kim Il-sung in this idealization of reuniting the territories, which was a failed effort by both North and the South to cross the 38th parallel and unify under one government or the other. This was part of the Geneva Convention, which I failed to mention. But nonetheless, there was considerable momentum in reading a lot of these different sources that indicate that the Korean War was by no means inevitable, but it was certainly very possible, especially in the years leading up to it. As part of this report, the United States noticed that it would be at least 5 years, and again, this report was authored before the war had begun, so this isn't even considering the monetary or like land resources destroyed during the war. They estimated it would take about 5 years for the Korean government to come off like half of the subsidies, and then about 10 years for them to become fully self-sufficient. So in a lot of ways, you can kind of consider South Korea at this time, as being part of a protectorate of not necessarily their own choosing, but a far more charitable protectorate under the United States. And don't get me wrong, I'm not sitting here trying to say that the United States did everything right all the time forever. That's obviously not what I'm saying. I'm trying to communicate at this point that the United States was self-interested to support Korea to further the containment policy. I told you he would be back. So that was the period between 1945 and 1950. And so we're back in war. As you know, the United States was the primary force in the Korean War. MacArthur was the commander-in-chief, or general-in-chief rather, of all UN forces. At this time, there was a significant international support. The only reason that the UN resolution was passed was because the Soviet Union and China boycotted the UN vote. So, not interesting history there, but not necessarily the point. Economically, during the war period, that shouldn't say interwar, I apologize. A lot of economic programs were developed to sort of help Korea along the path of to establish their own economic foundations and lay groundwork for them to become self-sufficient in the future. The United Nations Korean Reconstruction Agency, or UNCRA, was established in 1950, just before Chinese intervention in the war. It's actually a very curious timeline because the war had been declared. It was beyond June 25th, but nonetheless, the UN felt they saw it still as necessary to establish an economic rehabilitation program rather than focus all their energy on the war effort. Nonetheless, it was established. It was led by General Charles Lloyd of Australia, which again sort of reaffirms this wider idea that Korean economic development was very much a global effort. It was by no means just a United States effort. I focus on it a lot in this presentation because historically there's not a way to consider the history of Korean development, economic development, without putting the United States as the leader in that, for a litany of reasons, but nonetheless. There was nearly $150 million contributed. Majority of it was by the United States. It was seconded by New Zealand, Australia, and I believe Germany. No, not Germany. Maybe England. I should know that. Nonetheless, most of their interests were in developing industry. At this point, they were trying to establish sort of, or rather, reestablish what the Japanese had been doing 6 years earlier and offer the Koreans with a industrial program that they were in charge of and they could reap the benefits of. And when I say the Koreans, I mean the government, not the people, because as I discussed earlier, this was by no means a democracy. Alongside UNCRA, the United Nations Civil Assistance Corps Korea, UNCAC, leave it to the military to come up with amazing acronyms, as always. This was another economic development program, but it was far more interested in the infrastructure development of Korea. It nonetheless still provided funding for their various internal projects, but as I said, industrial or infrastructural development. They also focused on healthcare and food supply. This was a little bit after the war that this program really started to establish itself, but nonetheless, it was formed during the Korean War. The military costs of the United States and sort of UN collectively for the war were about 64 billion, or excuse me, over 64 billion. The US shouldered a burden of about 64 billion alone. So this is to say that the Korean War saw a lot of subsidizing by the UN and the United States specifically to look forward into the future as far as when the war would be over. The Korean War by no means was an easy win. In fact, it was a stalemate toward the end. But early on in the war, they had enough confidence, the UN that is, had enough confidence to establish these economic programs that they felt that South Korea wouldn't fall so easy. And it didn't, and now it has a great economy, so it wasn't all for naught. But after the war, UNCRA remained in power, not in power. UNCRA program was sustained until 1958, when the UN decided to stop funding the program. But nonetheless, it at that point had achieved quite a bit in the development of infrastructure. The Korean government, or the Korean economic health and the political health of the state was rather tumultuous after the war. Park Chung-hee's 1961 coup threw a whirlwind of problems toward the state. There was an economic spiral, a political struggle, obviously. But he had in mind a lot of different economic development plans. He had 5-year plans. He had one 10-year plan, but nonetheless, he came into office with intentions to sort of set the Korean economy in motion. A part of his regime, I think it's fair to refer to it as a regime, was economic and industrial development. Initially, he was heavily focused on heavy industry development, as at that point that was certainly the most economically beneficiary of the soft or heavy, but nonetheless, focused on heavy. Alongside that, as I mentioned earlier in the project, or the lecture rather, there was limited resource mineral extraction opportunities. Korea does have a coal mining industry and produces sulfur. It's the #3 producer of sulfur in the world. But none of these industries were substantial enough to really make enough of a dent to push Korea in a mining direction. Clunkily said, but nonetheless. A part of his development was a joint effort by the United States to create a Korean Institute for Industrial Technology and Applied Science. On that mouthful. This was an international formed college spearheaded by LBJ. It was a highly diversified school. It focused on, I think their curriculum covered like 24 different topics, but all relative to the realm of science and technology, the technological development. And it was from very early on clear that the institute was formed in the idea that this would lead to economic development, and it certainly did. There was 12 other nations that contributed and sent professors to the institute to assist in developing Korea. So once again, reaffirming that Korean economic development was an international project. Excuse me. Jumping ahead a little bit here, but we're going to get to Nixon Doctrine and Vietnamization, which, what a mouthful, but nonetheless. These projects do come into play during this period of the war as Vietnam started to develop into the conflict that it would become. The United States began to reallocate resources away from Korea into Vietnam. And this next slide, we'll start to see how that showed itself. Here he is again. Oh, Vietnam, you're okay. Republic of Korea. Don't know if I've said it out loud yet. Nonetheless, the ROK military was entirely funded by the UN and the United States. They didn't produce any of their arms at home, and all the training was done by the United States military. During the beginning of Vietnam, the ROK and Park were very interested in involving the ROK military in the struggle. This played into LBJ's many flags policy, which was an effort by him to amass more international support for Vietnam, especially considering the support that the United States had during Korea. In the Korean War, there was over a dozen coalition forces that participated. In Vietnam, he struggled to find more than 6. So when the ROK offered to send troops, it not only reflected a sort of long-term Korean success, but also an international effort against communism again. The ROK forces were included early, as I mentioned, with about 20,000 troops joining the United States troops in 1966. For their participation, the United States offered financial support. As I said, the United States funded their military top down, and that was a stipulation included in the ROK entrance into Vietnam. They didn't have the financial capacity at that time to support their own military abroad. So the United States shouldered that burden. Further, it was in the interest of PARC to deploy troops in the region because without doing so, the United States would have had to reallocate troops from Korea to Vietnam. The geopolitical turmoil was still very much real in Korea. The Northern Territory had not ceded any sort of concession, as we know. The demilitarized zone is by no means peaceful, and South Korean and North Korean tension remains today. So, 10 years after the war, it was no different. The effectiveness of the ROK in Vietnam is it's somewhat vague considering the historiography. The Vietnamese saw them as especially barbaric. There is a number of My Lai-esque tragedies that the ROK had performed on civilians, and they are especially brutal toward the Vietnamese. There's currently, yeah, it's sort of one of those things where there's lawsuits by the Vietnamese against South Korea for their actions during the war, which is far more symbolic than it is actually practical. But nonetheless, it shows a recognition by some that the ROK were overly brutal. And then there are still some historians that regard them as being sort of an ineffective symbolic force. And this comes to a later point about their financial costs just to have them there. As I said, the United States funded their military entirely, and to have them in Korea as a supporting force cost about $1 billion a year. And Nixon, in passing, once said that they need $18 million just to move out of the enclave. So this all just stands to represent that while it was a symbolic victory financially, not much of a success for the United States. But on the other hand, for the Koreans, this sort of further played into their goals of international subsidization. The United States, they didn't really want to be included in this Vietnamization process or just entirely the Nixon Doctrine, which ostensibly was a roll down of military involvement in these territories and sort of a transition of responsibility to these local governments, which in the case of Korea, arguably, would have played into the North Koreans' ability to take over the nation, and then we'd be back in the conflict. But nonetheless, that didn't happen in Korea just because of their involvement in Vietnam. So what's the point of this? Why do we look at Korea as sort of an interesting case study of Cold War economics? It is very heavily studied in a lot of different facets around the Cold War, but it does receive a special attention because of its prominence today. So hopefully what you derive from this lecture is Korean economic development was very much an international project. They're being hamstringed by the Japanese in their ability to sort of set up their own industries, whether they would have or not, excuse me, is irrelevant because their ability to develop with the assistance of international subsidy and the UN in particular, allowed the state to industrialize and become technologically proficient so fast that it is very much unprecedented. It was the first really successful battleground for Cold War economic policy. That's not to say that the diplomatic democratization of these different territories under threat of communism, Korea was not a good representation of that, considering the political turmoil, but nonetheless, the economic development policies that were directed at Korea by the UN and the Western powers did very much turn out to be fruitful. And it sort of shows this wider arc of the imperialism's effect on localized economies. The Korean economy was very much a victim of imperialism, but it is a sort of unique case in that it was able to co-opt that oppression into a net positive. And of course, you could say that it would be better off without it, but that's a counterfactual, and here we are. So, nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and maybe you learned something, and I hope it met your criteria. Thank you much, and have a good night.